Well, good evening. It is good in very many ways to be here from Michigan. First of all, we've got almost nothing that looks green up there yet. Nothing's blooming. Down here it looks awful green. We're probably a month behind you on our winter schedule. But the other reason it's good to be here is I feel like I'm coming back home. I'm a Missouri native, actually. I was born in Washington, Missouri. And I didn't spend too much time there, but I grew up on the Illinois side on a farm in southern Illinois, and my mom's a St. Louis girl. I married a Kansas City girl, so I feel like I've got very good roots here. And it was thrilling to see the Show Me Institute just about 3 years ago form in Missouri. If I'm not mistaken, Missouri was the largest state at that time that did not have a think tank devoted to analyzing public policy from a free market perspective. And as I'll show tonight, that's a critical part of the policy debate in any state. And so Show Me was a welcome addition and is going great guns. It's put itself on the map in public policy. Everybody understands what the Salvation Army does. And everybody understands what the Red Cross does. And these are all nonprofits. They're supported similarly to the way the Show Me Institute is supported, but think tanks like the Show Me Institute have a problem. Nobody knows what a think tank does or how it does it. So it's actually kind of the worst thing about working for a think tank is that you always have to say, now what in the world is a think tank and what do you do? My brother one time asked me, so are you thinking right now? And are you being paid overtime? Everybody understands that what the soup kitchen do, it helps hungry people, but few people understand how think tanks help establish public policy. And how do think tanks change public policy? That's what we're going to talk about tonight. Well, first, some broad concepts. Public policy change starts with political change. All right? It isn't think tank guys who go in and vote for the public policy that becomes law. It's people in the political system. Elected officials. We even have at least one here tonight. Political change in a democracy starts with social change. And social change always precedes durable political change. So, yeah, you can pass a bill, but if it doesn't have some kind of broad support, for good reasons or bad reasons, it probably won't stay law long. Social change is an important part of public policy. Now, if you don't think this is so, if it strikes you a little funny, just think about this. Think about some other social movements that this country has had that have resulted in big policy changes, and ask yourself, would the policy changes have come if the social movements hadn't been there? What about the movement to abolish slavery? Can you think of anything that's more enshrined in our law in this country? You may not own another person, yet that began with a social movement, the movement to abolish that. What about the civil rights movement? What about the labor union movement? The prohibition movement, the suffrage movement, the environmental movement? And I'm not saying that all of these have resulted in great public policies, but the point is, social movements preceded these durable policy changes. So how do think tanks change, to know how think tanks change policy, we have to know how think tanks create social change. Now, I'm going to ask you a question that's patterned after something that Lawrence Reed used to ask his freshman students when he was a professor of economics years ago. Lawrence Reed is the first president of the Mackinac Center and my immediate successor. He was an economics professor like Joe is. Now, he used to ask this of his college freshmen, and I know everybody here is smarter than college freshmen. Right? Shouldn't have any problem with this. So, Joe, if you would go to this slide, what is it that determines whether a society embraces limited government or, on the other hand, whether that society embraces expansive government? So, go ahead and shout out your answer if you know the answer. What is it? Can you think of anything that influences a society one way or the other?
Popular sentiment.
Popular sentiment, right? That's related to it. What are some other things?
Standard of living.
Standard of living can certainly have a bearing. Any actors in society, what kinds of things have influence? Education is a big component, that's right. Hey, government itself can have an influence, that's right. Now, you know, Larry Reed asked this question of college freshmen. Did you know college is a place where knowledge accumulates? The freshmen come in with some, and the seniors don't leave with much, and so knowledge accumulates in college. But no, the answer that Larry was looking for to this question was not the things that have been mentioned so far. People or the institutions that they create do play important roles, like the schools, like the political parties, factors like standard of living, but they don't explain why people behave the way that they do. And some people have even explained that it's just because it's fun to spend other people's money. Go ahead, Joe. It's not a liberal or conservative thing necessarily. You may not be able to read this in the back, but Senator Yomp is talking to his colleague there, and he says, liberal or conservative, it's just fun spending taxpayer money. But that isn't ultimately what influences it either. Joe? The thing that determines whether a society embraces limited government or society embraces expansive government is ideas. It's so basic we might not even have thought of it. But ideas themselves underlie huge changes in how societies are organized like that. Victor Hugo, the author, famously said that ideas are more powerful than all the armies of the world. It is ideas that create a stage on which all of us perform. Think about it. Almost every single thing that surrounds us, whether it's an object or an institution or a way of doing things, is the result of somebody's idea. Joe? Lawrence Reed summed it up this way in a pamphlet that he wrote in 1994 for our think tank, the Mackinac Center. What people believe determines how they behave, who they vote for, what laws and rules they embrace, and what kind of system they'll work to achieve. Change ideas and you can change the course of history. Now, is there any way to channel these ideas? Let's look at the way a famous economist, perhaps the most influential economist of the 20th century, described the power of ideas. Next slide, Joe. John Maynard Keynes said, "The ideas of economists and political philosophers, when they're right and when they're wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else. Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from intellectual influences are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. Sooner or later, it is ideas and not vested interests which are dangerous for good or evil." And so, if we get our minds around the idea that it is ideas themselves that determine our destiny as far as how we organize society, and we have to ask ourselves, well, is there any way to channel these ideas, or are we simply at the mercy of nameless, faceless intellectual forces? Well, I want to tell you a little story about a man who grappled with that question. After World War II, a British fighter pilot, who later became a stockbroker, who later became a farmer, he was concerned that the nation that he and his family members had fought for in World War II would lose the fight to remain free even after they had won the war. In Great Britain, socialism was galloping in, and he was very concerned about this. And so he sought an economist named Friedrich Hayek, who eventually went on to win a Nobel Prize. Friedrich Hayek had written a very stirring defense of economic and personal liberty during the war, and this book was called, does anybody know the name of the book? I bet some people here have read it. Bob? The Road to Serfdom, that's exactly right. The Road to Serfdom was a cry in the middle of the war, hey, if we're not careful, we're going to do exactly what the people we're trying to defeat are doing. And so this economist, Friedrich Hayek, understood how ideas shaped society. Now, the former fighter pilot thought that the best way to get his government back on track would be to run for office, get involved in politics. But Hayek told him, you know, you have an understanding of these ideas that would allow you to do something more. He said, you'd be wasting your time if all you did was get involved in politics. You need to get involved in ideas because ultimately the intellectuals will determine how the politicians act. Think about that. Now, Hayek called these politicians, Hayek called these developers of ideas, these intellectuals, second-hand dealers in ideas. Second-hand dealers. Now, he didn't mean that as an insult. He merely recognized that there are actually very, very few people generating truly new, original ideas. There's nothing new under the sun. Almost all of the other intellectuals contribute to the march of ideas by developing the ideas, communicating those ideas, or expanding the influence of the ideas along the way. So later economists have observed that these ideas follow sort of a predictable progression through society. Joe, you want to show the next slide? And here is how ideas transfer through society. Starting with the idea originators, a very rare bunch of people, then down to the intellectuals or the second-hand dealers of ideas. And today we might call those people, or might be people in the media, they might be people in universities, they might be people at think tanks. And then to the culture at large, and finally to the political class. So what do you notice about this transfer? A change doesn't start with politics. In fact, the political step is merely the last step in a long march toward converting an idea into a policy change. Now, new ideas are seldom met with open arms, right? Ideas are ridiculed, especially by the people who are making their living on the old ideas. The ideas that eventually make their way into law typically meet with responses that look like this next slide. This is a progression for the response to those ideas. First, it's indifferent. They'll ignore you. And then you know you're making progress and they ridicule you when they make fun of you. Then it's rejection and on to attack and criticism. I'll read through the list because I know the letters are small in the back. After criticism is where they have to really start grappling with your idea. They have to say, well, here's why your idea won't work. Here's why it won't work, Joe, to put privately owned roads in Missouri. Here's why it won't work to scrap the income tax and replace it with something else. And then a plausible or partial consideration. Well, Joe, your idea would work if it were a little different. Or if we could maybe try part of your idea. Well, then we move to tolerance, and then desirability, and then necessity, and then inevitability, and acceptance, and finally, hey, I knew it was a good idea all along. I mean, that's where Social Security is today. Social Security started out as an idea that was so untenable that no one paid it any serious attention except for the intellectuals developing it. Well, now, as far as society is concerned, how could we live without it? And so, if we know this about ideas and how they move through society, how can we influence public policy? Next slide. Hayek said that politicians are sort of like actors, but we can write the script. In other words, politicians can't do anything that they want. And I'm getting a big smile out of Mr. Jetton. Hayek said to this fighter pilot, whose name was Anthony Fisher, politicians are like corks bobbing in the ocean. You can be the current. Okay? So, one of my colleagues at the Mackinac Center actually developed a model that shows how ideas progress from one phase to the next. How do think tanks change public policy? Joe, show us the next slide. And we've called it the Overton Window of Political Possibility. It's named after my colleague Joe Overton. And what we have here is a list of government policies on education. And for those of you who can read the list clearly, I'd like you to just shout out if you notice any pattern. These are organized in a specific way. Can you tell me what the pattern is? These are all public policies on education. At the very top is no government schools, and at the bottom is compulsory indoctrination in government schools.
The bottom is where we are.
Joe DeLong said the bottom is where we are. That's close. These are organized in order at the bottom of the scale from less freedom to the top of the scale to more freedom. Or another way to say it is from more government to less government involvement in education. All right? And this isn't to say whether any of these policies are good or bad. That's just how they're organized here. So now I want to actually switch to another device on my computer. Here we have the same list of educational policies. And I'm going to show you what the window of political possibility looked like in Michigan when the Mackinac Center was founded. I've shaded the areas that were within the window of what was politically possible. And what do I mean by the window of political possibility? What I mean is what we said before. Politicians are not free to support any policy they want, because if they vote for something that the voters consider too radical, they'll get bounced out of office. And politicians typically want to stay in office. And so at any given time, there's a certain range of ideas that are not too hot, not too cold, just right, as Goldilocks would say. And the just right ones are within the window of political possibility. So in Michigan, when the Mackinac Center was founded, homeschooling was illegal. And at the top of the scale, we had a state-mandated curriculum. There was no public school choice at all in Michigan. So you couldn't even choose what government school you wanted to go to. Well, you could, but you had to buy a house in the right district. That was how you exercised school choice in 1988. So notice a couple of things about the window. First of all, it's down on the lower part of the scale, and it's also kind of narrow. If you were an elected official in 1988 in Michigan, and you wanted to talk about charter schools, for example, that was very risky politically and would probably get you bounced from office. So you couldn't even talk about it. But when the second-hand dealers in ideas can talk about these ideas and analyze them and show how they might work, two things can happen. First of all, you can shift the window up and make it safe to talk about public school choice or charter schools. And you can also make the window bigger. It doesn't even have to stay the same size. So I'll show you the window now in Michigan in education policy after the Mackinac Center had been in business for about 10 years. It actually became safe to talk about vouchers and tax credits. I'll put the window right there. Homeschooling was broadly legalized, and now any politician in Michigan who wants to talk about making it illegal is going to run some real political risks. It's really not quite safe to talk about. And at the top of the scale, you can talk about tuition tax credits and vouchers without getting run out of office. Now, they're not policy in Michigan right now, but the political climate has changed. So this is a model that we use to show how think tanks shape what we call a window of political possibility. Okay, and now let's switch back to PowerPoint. So then in the world of politics, from an elected official's perspective, this is how ideas go from outside the window to well within the window. First, these new policies are unthinkable. Well, we couldn't possibly let parents choose their own schools. I mean, they might choose the wrong school for their child. It's unthinkable. And then it moves to merely radical. Well, maybe some parents would be capable of it, but it's a pretty radical choice. I mean, why would you want to choose your own school? I mean, that's why we draw school districts around neighborhoods. Then it becomes acceptable, then sensible, popular, and finally policy. Now, these do usually happen in order, but it's not necessarily a smooth progression. When there is political opportunity, things can change very fast. It often happens in a crisis. Now, we're seeing this in economic policy in this country right now, aren't we? I mean, 1 year ago, who could have imagined partial nationalization of banks, possibly nationalization of automobile companies, and on and on. I don't have to tell you what all has been going on. That happened in 1 short year, and it was in response to a crisis. But these ideas didn't come out of nowhere. Think tanks help prepare the way so that policymakers can act when the crises come or when the political opportunities come. Why don't you go to the next slide, Joe? I like the way that Milton Friedman said this. Milton Friedman, who died just last year or about a year and a half ago. In 1962, he said, "Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. And when that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken," he meant by elected leaders, "the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around." That, I believe, is our basic function. He meant the think tanks. That's the think tank's basic function. To develop alternatives to existing policies and to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable. And so, think tanks aren't the folks who are actually getting laws passed, but they can have a tremendous influence on the environment that passes laws. A writer named John Miller wrote a story on think tanks for Philanthropy magazine. And I want to show you how he summed up, go ahead, Joe, how he summed up what think tanks do. He said, "Think tanks are perhaps best at creating conditions for success as opposed to being directly responsible for the success itself. The manager of a baseball team can make his team's victory or defeat more or less likely based on the choices he makes before anybody even swings a bat. But likewise, it is always nearly impossible to draw a straight line from the product of a think tank to any particular public policy." And so that's what makes explaining what think tanks do kind of difficult. You can't draw that straight line. A lot of people who look at the political world, the policy world, if they want to know how public policy comes into being, but all they look at is the legislature, it's like watching a football game through a hole in the fence that only lets you see the 10 yards in front of the goal line. Because that is precisely where the scoring happens. But you miss the plays further up the field that set up the big play. And this is the role of idea generators in our society. Think tanks, media, academics, and so on and so forth. And these are critical to moving these ideas along. The policies being put in place today in Washington are not being grabbed out of thin air and devised by the elected officials there. They were developed a long time ago by the defunct economists that John Maynard Keynes talked about and have been lying around for the right opportunity. Now, I told you about this fighter pilot who wanted to get involved. And the economist said, don't just run for office, get involved in ideas. Well, his name was Anthony Fisher, and he went on to make a fortune in the chicken business. He was a chicken farmer. He helped found two very remarkable think tanks. One was the Institute of Economic Affairs in Britain, and one was the Atlas Foundation for Economic Research here in the United States. He's considered one of the godfathers in the free market think tank movement. The Institute of Economic Affairs was sort of the intellectual root of a lot of Margaret Thatcher's policy ideas. And the Atlas Foundation in our country has helped support think tanks, including ours and Show Me Institute, the Heritage Foundation, Cato Institute, others that you may have heard of in this country. And so I always love giving this talk to folks like you, because we often find, as we're looking for people to support this kind of work, we run into lots of people who understand the importance of supporting the right political candidates. It's critically important, because not everybody who's at first and goal scores, right? Political leadership is important. But we also find that people become frustrated. People who support political candidates become frustrated. They said, I put this money into politics, and what did I get for it? I got a guy who told me he couldn't vote his conscience. Too often that's what they hear. We try to help people understand that they, like Anthony Fisher, they also need to be active in the world of ideas, to stretch that window of political possibility, to give the elected officials some running room and the intellectual ammunition they need to get good policy passed. And I think the better we all understand how think tanks work, the better we'll be able to carry worthwhile ideas to fruition through that political process. Most of the kind of policy changes we're interested in can't be accomplished in one legislative session or one political cycle. We're in this for the long haul. The ideas of liberty and free market and limited governments are ideas that the whole country was founded on. These are ideas that don't translate themselves immediately to public policy. They need someone to explain, well, what's a free market transportation system look like? If we had a limited government, who would feed poor people? These aren't immediately obvious to everyone, and it's our job to explain that. That's what the Show Me Institute is here for, and it's a critical role in better public policy in Missouri, to help create durable policy changes grounded in social change. So that's how think tanks change public policy, and I would be happy to take any questions that you have. One question I get sometimes is, well, should I stop supporting politicians? I said, well, I would stop supporting a politician who lied to you, but in general, no. We need people to be engaged both politically and in the world of ideas.
I have a question.
Yes?
It appears to me Great Britain has gotten a long way from Margaret Thatcher. What happened over there and become so liberal compared to Britain under her?
Yeah, the question is, things seem to have gotten away from some of the things Margaret Thatcher accomplished in Britain. And I'm not an expert on British policy by any means, but I think just looking at what we've talked about tonight, one way to explain it would be that they accomplished some policy changes without necessarily having the underlying social change to make those policy changes durable. They've got a parliamentary system there, of course, which works a little differently from ours. In some ways, it's easier to make fast change there. Now, it worked in favor of limited governments when Thatcher was in charge. She was able to quickly reverse a lot of very destructive policies, but a lot of those were undone too. And probably the United States is a little more resilient to that because of the long, we've never been that far down the road to socialism as Britain was for so long. Yes, sir.
What would you say, what are you most proud of in terms of in Michigan, the influence that you've had as a think tank?
One of the things that I'm most proud of is getting sued by the teachers union. We've been very active in education policy and labor policy, and so much so, like Joe explained, we were cranking out study after study showing the need for school choice. The schools were not spending their money wisely, how they could privatize and save more money. We were showing how much it cost the state in remedial education every year because the K-12 system didn't do a good enough job. So the teachers union in Michigan actually formed its own think tank, an education think tank. They called it the Great Lakes Center, and they called a news conference. They invited us to it. And they said, we're forming this think tank to counter what the Mackinac Center is doing. And the president of the union said, frankly, I admire what the Mackinac Center has done, getting their information to legislators in many cases better than we have, and so on. Well, we love that quote so much that we quoted him in a fundraising letter. And the union sued us, said that we weren't allowed to repeat the quote that he had said at his own news conference. And we very much enjoyed when our Court of Appeals threw the lawsuit out unanimously. That was a big victory. But I do enjoy that, but policy-wise, you know, this has been a rough few years policy-wise. We had our 20th anniversary gala last November. And it was my job at that point to remind people in the middle of a grim time. We had it 1 week after the election. It was not a happy time. It was my job to remind people that even though things look grim now, things were worse when the Mackinac Center opened its doors. Our income tax rates were higher. Our property tax increases were not capped by law. We had an economic development system that allowed government to take property from one owner and transfer it to another private owner if the second owner would pay more in taxes. That was legal before the policy changed. And there were several changes like that. So if I had to sum up the policy thing that I'm most proud of, it would be when the state's leading newspaper editorial page said almost no one can talk about public policy anymore without taking the Mackinac Center's ideas into account. And that's all we want is a fair debate. Yes.
What are some of the names of the liberal think tanks that are out there that are trying to counter libertarian conservative?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. What is the name of some of the liberal think tanks that are trying to counter some of the free market ideas? The left has taken a different approach that hasn't been focused exclusively on think tanks. And it's, I believe it's being quite effective. Think tanks, the Brookings Institution in Washington is considered certainly left of center. The Urban Institute, the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, which we sometimes call the Center for Bigger Budgets. They do have their think tanks, but I think even more important than the think tanks is the advantage some of the left ideas have in the media and in academia. And I think those are certainly as influential or more so than think tanks.
Why do you suppose, comment to your other conversation, why do you suppose that those of us who talk radio are so far to the right and those people who are anchoring the national news are so far to the left? And where does that divide come from? It seems to me that the positions I endorse are common sense. I don't understand how the other media get so far away.
Yeah, what accounts for the difference between sort of the philosophy you hear on talk radio versus the rest of the media? I think that's a terrific question. I wish somebody would do their PhD thesis on that question. You know, you remember as well as I do, you're in the business, you remember when that changed. It changed with the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine. And that was 1988 or 87. And so the Fairness Doctrine used to mandate federal law that radio and TV stations would give equal time. If they put one sort of view on the air, they had to give equal time to the other view. Well, the result of that was there were very few views on the air because they didn't want to have to give equal time. When the Fairness Doctrine was repealed, the first radio guy to take advantage of it in a big way was Rush Limbaugh. I don't know if he was the very first, but he was the one who got famous first after the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine. And I think some future study will show whether it was just because the people who listen to talk radio maybe are business owners who are able to listen to it some during the day. Maybe it was people who own small businesses who understand the harmful effects of large government policies. I don't know. Yes?
You're Mackinac Institute taking a position about what ought to be done with the big three automakers? Since this is a big issue in Michigan.
Yeah, has the Mackinac Center taken a position on the big three, what ought to be done? Yeah, this was painful for us. We are the free market outfit in Michigan, and we've cultivated a reputation that if you want to know the free market approach, you go to the Mackinac Center. Well, in Michigan, it's hard to describe how dependent the state feels on those three automakers. It's a huge part of the economy, bigger than maybe anything in any other state, a single industry. And it's also part of the state's psyche. And so when there was the policy option to bail out these companies, you've got hundreds of thousands of people who believe that their immediate livelihood depended on those bailouts. And so we did not take any joy in saying that good policy dictates that we don't rob Peter to pay Paul here. We took a very public position that the bailouts were very bad policy and that the automakers had a very dark valley to go through. But the sooner we get it started, the sooner we'll get it over with. You know, as you may know, those car companies won't necessarily avoid bankruptcy even now into their second bailout. And as you might imagine, we have had that space in the debate pretty much to ourselves in Michigan. But we don't shy away from taking the free market position. That's what we have to do. If we don't say it, who will? Interestingly, our senior economist was a vice president for economics at the largest bank in the state before he retired and joined us. So he was first in line in the state to say that the banks shouldn't be bailed out either. And he probably didn't get invited to a couple of cocktail parties from his old friends after that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Joe.